Mary. Mary. Oh, I'm hungry. Are you on your way up to the store again?
Oh, hey, guys.
Oh, Phil, you're back. How was school today?
Oh, there's no school today, Gramps. Just practice.
Okay, I am on my way out. Dad, you stay comfortable. I'll grab some food and bring it back later.
But Mary, I'm hungry now.
You'll be fine for a little bit, Dad. I'll hurry, okay? Can you get your grandpa a glass of water and take him back to his room? Here, Dad, make sure you take your pill today too, okay?
I thought I already did.
Nope, and you missed yesterday too, so just take a couple of extra. He'll be fine, he just needs a nap.
What'd you say?
Nothing, Dad. Make sure to have a lie down. Okay, I'll see you guys when I get back.
All right, come on, Gramps. Let's go. All right. Almost there, Gramps. Almost there. All right, and yeah, there you go. There you go, Gramps. Let's go.
Wait, you're not gonna just leave him like that, are you?
He'll be fine.
I don't know, man. That just doesn't seem right.
He'll be fine. My mom gave him something that's gonna help him sleep for a while. Come on, we're gonna be late for practice.
You know what? I just remembered. I gotta go home first and get my cleats. So I'll just meet you there, okay?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll see you there.
Okay.
Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Mosqueda. Dr. Mosqueda did her medical training at USC, her internship and was chief resident also at USC, did fellowships at UCSF and at Rancho Los Amigos Medical Center as part of USC. She, of course, is previously the chair of family medicine and the Ronald Reagan Endowed Chair in Geriatrics here at UCI. And is now chair and professor of family medicine and professor of geriatrics and gerontology and associate dean of primary care at the Keck School of Medicine at USC, as well as the director of the National Center on Elder Abuse, and she founded the first elder abuse forensic center in the United States. Dr. Mosqueda.
You people. All right. We're going to be talking about a difficult topic, the topic of elder abuse, although I do like to point out when people say I work in elder abuse that I am against it, to be completely clear. And I really applaud the organizers' efforts to be willing to take on difficult subjects like this. In fact, the whole day is taking on these difficult subjects, which is a very rare and wonderful thing. So I'm really appreciative to be invited here to talk about this other difficult topic of elder abuse and neglect. One thing I want to stay straight out is that we use these really difficult pejorative terms like abuse and neglect, and it makes it even harder for us to talk about it because of these terms. At some point, I hope that we'll change some of the terms that we're using so that it doesn't have this horrible pejorative, sense that makes it harder for us to talk about. Because the vast majority of abuse and neglect that's going on, and there is plenty of it, is not being done by bad people who need to be put away in jail. It's being done by well-meaning people who've become overwhelmed and who can't do the work that needs to happen on behalf of somebody who is susceptible or vulnerable. And I want us to keep that in mind as we go along because of the harsh terms that we use, but to remember that we really need, I believe, to be compassionate and empathetic for what caregivers are going through, not to excuse any abuse or neglect, never to say that it's okay, but also so that we can understand why it's happening so that we can work towards prevention and amelioration. And you'll hear me say that again at the end, but it's so important that I wanted to say it at the beginning as well. Now, if you're like me, the first thing you think about with abuse and neglect is seaweed. Fortunately, most of you are not like me. But I just want you to take a look at this seaweed for a minute and see if something looks a little bit strange about it. And I'll give you one more view of it. And now, how many of you know what this is? It's a seahorse. It's called a leafy sea dragon. All right? Now, I'm going to show you the first picture again and see if you spot it. Right away now, right? And I will bet that the vast majority of us did not see it on the first go-round. And what I would say is that if you don't know that it exists, you've never heard of a leafy sea dragon, and then once you know it exists, if you don't actually look for it, and then actually recognize it when you find it, you will never see a leafy sea dragon. And I would submit to you that elder abuse can be somewhat similar. That we have age-related changes and illnesses that mask and mimic signs of elder abuse. Of course they have a bruise, they're old. Of course they have a fracture, they're old. Of course they have a pressure sore, they're old. And no, you can't believe anything they say because they have Alzheimer's disease. And so it makes it very hard to diagnose and detect abuse and neglect. But we certainly won't find it if we don't believe that it exists and look for it and call it out when we see it. And right now, I will tell you, those of us in the medical profession are doing a pretty lousy job of it. So we need to get better at this. And that's what we'll be talking a little bit about today, particularly in this subgroup of people who have dementing illnesses. So I was going to say, I apologize if I insult some of the folks in the audience when I talk about this, but really I don't care. I mean, I still love you and everything, but I think we just have to get to a point now where we're calling it as we see it, and trying to figure out what we can do about it in order to make things better. So the challenge of identifying an injury as abuse or neglect are things like age-related changes, people who have multiple problems. So not only do you have age-related changes because you're 85, but you also have Parkinson's disease, or you have polymyalgia rheumatica and you're on high doses of prednisone, et cetera. You've got medication effects. Of course, they're bruised, they're on Coumadin, or they're on some other sort of a blood thinner. You've got cognitive impairment. We can't believe what they're saying, even though they're telling us that something bad is going on. And this really can make it difficult to figure out what the heck is going on. So even though I think it's tough, we have to get to a point now where we say, it doesn't matter if it's tough. We do plenty of other tough things. We need to figure out how to do this. And I'm going to go through a few examples, and I'm not going to show you any awful pictures, so I want people to not worry about that. But I'm just going to show you some studies that we've done that look at how we're trying to figure some things out. And then we're going to focus in a minute exclusively on people who have dementing illnesses. So we did some studies looking at bruising in older adults, because it is true that older adults bruise easily. How many of you in the past few weeks have had a bruise? Okay. And were you even aware of it until somebody said, how did you get that bruise? Most of us are like, gosh, I don't know. I didn't even realize I had a bruise there. So we do know that we bruise by accident, but the question is, what kind of bruising happens non-accidental? And these are some studies that we did that looked at, when we say anterior comparison, that's like this. And what can you see between people with accidental bruising and physical abuse is you see a lot more bruising on the head, neck, and torso and upper arms. And if you go to a posterior comparison, I'll spare you showing that on me, you will see Again, a different bruising pattern that occurs. And what we found, I'm not going to go into details now because I'm just trying to get the point across, hey, you know what? We can tell emergency room physicians, primary care physicians, people who work in adult daycare programs, emergency medical technicians out in the field, if you're seeing these kinds of bruising patterns, big bruises, multiple bruises, bruises on face and neck, don't just overly accept that they're old and they bruise easily. Ask some questions. Similarly, we're encouraging people to look more at blood tests. If I have somebody coming in and I'm treating them for their thyroid disease, and we look at this particular test down here called the TSH, and as we're treating them, we expect that to normalize, and it's not getting better, what do doctors typically do? I'm going to keep giving you more medication. Well, maybe they're not getting it. Maybe there's some neglect going on. Maybe there's a problem. Again, look for the leafy sea dragon, know that it exists, and think that maybe something else might be happening here. Is there evidence that somebody with a feeding tube is getting malnourished? Why is that happening? Maybe it's because they're not getting their feeding. So we have to think about these things and use our heads along with physical and laboratory evidence. Signs of neglect, people who come in who are malnourished or dehydrated. And I just had this happen when I was seeing patients last week. Somebody who was moderately demented being brought in by an adult son who seemed curiously disengaged during the visit. But mom was looking pretty good. But one thing we do is almost always take off shoes and socks. And what did I find? But very elongated nails, very, very poor hygiene. He had cleaned her up, but never thought we were going to take off the shoes and socks. And I just was in touch with a social worker who did a house call, and we're already going to be making an adult protective services report. So we have to look for these things and be aware that often we're working with people who are very vulnerable and susceptible to abuse and neglect, and think that something else might be going on besides they're just old. And you'll notice that I put here pressure sores without evidence of appropriate care. By no means do I think that every pressure sore is a sign of neglect. I think pressure sores can happen despite great care and adequate care and okay care. And sometimes I also think they're evidence of neglect. So again, it just has to be on our differential diagnosis so that we're considering that. Okay. I'm going to move on now and speak specifically, I'm moving on to the brain, that's what this symbolizes for me, and we're going to talk specifically about people with dementia. People who have a dementing illness might not even be able to recognize that they're being abused. They may be unable to report it if they think something bad is going on, and they may not be believed. And we see this very commonly, and this happens a lot also with law enforcement. Nobody believes them because they have Alzheimer's or some other sort of dementing illness. And again, I am aware of the fact that some people with dementia confabulate or make mistakes or call something abuse that really isn't. I even have people without dementia who say that. I have a patient in my office who has no dementia whatsoever. She knows I do research in this area, and she has reported to me that her daughter is abusive because she does not call her every day. Wherever Stacy Lindbergh is, you'll be happy to know I did not make an APS report on that one. So, I understand we need to use some common sense here, but there also are some bad things going on that we're just kind of poo-pooing and not being aware of. And we got to recall that people with dementing illnesses have a lot of different symptoms, right? In addition to things like cognitive symptoms, trouble with memory, there are often psychiatric symptoms that might include agitation, hallucinations, believing things that aren't really true. There might be motor changes, trouble with walking and swallowing, especially at the end stages for most of the dementing illnesses, and functional changes, needing more help with things, financial management. Boy, Grandma, I'm going to help you go to the store, but I'll need your ATM card in order to pick up your groceries, and I'll need the passcode. And then the bank account starts getting drained, right? So we know that people who have dementing illnesses are more susceptible to becoming abused and neglected. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of studies, because this is a big official UCI Mind conference, so I have to show you data. And And then we'll talk a little bit more data-free in a few minutes. And this was a study done by Claudia Cooper in England, looking at abusive people with dementia and their caregivers, or as she calls them, carers, and looking at a cross-sectional survey. And I'm just going to get you to the bottom line, which is she wanted to see how common it was for people living in the community with dementing illnesses, with family members, to be abused or neglected in some way. And she found 220 people living in London and Essex, and did interviews, and asked specifically about psychological abuse and physical abuse. And none of the caregivers said, oh, we're abusing them all the time, or even most of the time, but 115, okay? Half of the caregivers reported some kind of abuse having occurred during the prior year. Most of it was psychological abuse, but about 4% was physical abuse. And some of them said it was self-defense, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And some said, I just finally got fed up and I hit them. And don't worry too much about these bar graphs, but I did want to just show you that these over on the end with the large numbers are more of the psychological abuse. Now, some of us say, well, psychological abuse, not such a big deal. But when we're talking about psychological abuse, both in this study and in the study I'll show you that we did, this is not little minor people yelling at each other every now and again. It is threats, it is intimidation, it is somebody sitting on the side of a bed, waving a butcher knife, saying, stop calling me because you need to go to the bathroom. These are the kinds of things we're talking about, not minor events. And they're also things that are happening repeatedly. So these are really significant events that we're talking about. And interestingly, we did a similar kind of study, unbeknownst to us, across the pond, in a very similar fashion, looking at abuse of people, looking at abuse and neglect of people with dementia with colleagues here at UCI, and with a lot of partners here in Orange County for both this and the bruising study. And we also looked at 129 dyads of people with dementia and their caregivers. And again, we found that about half of people with dementia were being mistreated by their caregivers. Again, the majority psychological abuse, but other types of abuse as well. One of the reasons that this was, for me, a life-changing study is because it changed the way I practice medicine. And one of the things we learned through doing this study is not just, gee, it's really common, but that we could talk to people about this. And because the vast majority of abuse and neglect is not happening by evildoers, that you could sit down and talk to caregivers, and if they really know that you give a damn, sorry, sisters, if they really know that you care, I just saw my penguin friends up in front here, and I went, oh, man. Another mile in my road to, the people will tell you what's going on if they know that we care and we're offering a sympathetic ear and that we really want to help. And we did find that if you are somebody with a dementing illness who is more psychologically aggressive, or you push or shove the caregiver, you are also more likely to be abused. And people go, well, of course, because if the person who's getting care is resistant, then the caregiver is more likely to hit them. It kind of makes sense. But one thing I like to point out is this was what's called a cross-sectional study, not a longitudinal study. And it's also possible that the reason that older adult with dementia is acting in an aggressive way is because somebody's hitting them. So we don't know which way the arrow points. What we did find is that caregivers with higher amounts of anxiety or depression, who were more socially isolated themselves, largely because of their caregiving responsibilities, and who had a greater perceived burden. Some of us are caregivers because we adore our parents, and even though it's tough, we're honored to be in this position, and we have the financial resources to do it, and we've got social supports, and it's still really hard. Some of us are caregivers because there isn't anybody else to take care of them, and this is the miserable guy who used to beat me when I was a kid, and now I have to take care of him. And I know that whoever's coming through my office doors, I don't know which way it is when we come down and when we sit down and talk about things. And I have to be prepared either way. Again, no excuse for it. Just because he used to hit you when a kid doesn't make it okay for you to hit him now. But by me understanding that, I think it helps us work toward prevention and detection and amelioration. So we know that mistreatment in people with dementia is a very common thing. And what I've learned from these studies is that we have to ask people about the behavior of the person that they're caring for. Are they resistant to care? Are they yelling racial epithets at them, et cetera? And that I also then need to ask the caregiver about their own behaviors and their responses, so that we can try to figure out what's going on, and that screening is essential and that we should always ask. I'll come back to this point at the end of my talk as well. I just want to point out that this is anecdotal now, I don't have data, but what I'm seeing is that in people with early Alzheimer's disease, that's when we're getting a lot of financial abuse, like that ATM example I talked to you about earlier. In the middle or moderate stages of dementia, when there are more behavioral disturbances going on, is when we're tending to see a lot of physical abuse. And in the late stages, when there's problems with mobility and swallowing, et cetera, is when we're seeing neglect. And in fact, this is when we're actually seeing some criminal cases where people are neglected to death. And I have several cases sitting on my desk right now of people who died under horrible circumstance. And this is not by the well-meaning caregiver group of people. This is that unusual minority of caregivers who were up to no good. So this can seem very overwhelming and difficult to get a handle on because there's so many different things going on. And we developed and published a model called the abuse intervention model that I just want to mention for a moment because it helps me take something. One of the advantages, and anybody who's worked with me knows this, is I'm very simple-minded. So I try to boil down some complicated stuff like abuse and neglect into simpler things. And this is what we did with this model, is we said there's really 3 broad domains to look at. You know, there's the person, the older adult themselves. There's a trusted other who's the potential person who might be abusing them. And then there's the context of their situation. And if you look at those 3 domains, we know that people with dementia who tend to be aggressive verbally or physically, who are resistant to care, who are more dependent, are more vulnerable to being abused. We know that caregivers with anxiety, depression, and perceived burden are more likely to be abusive. And we know that if they're socially isolated, there's a lot of financial strain going on, the quality of the relationship has never been good, that also makes them more likely to be in an abusive sort of relationship. And so we're able to bring these different factors together, and we're actually working on mathematical models that can help with risk assessment and prediction. But this all kind of makes common sense that allows any of us who work with older adults who have dementing illnesses to start saying, even just based on our gut, knowing that you have this kind of model behind you, what a high-risk sort of situation is. And it gives me great hope that we're actually going to be able to prevent abusive situations from happening because we can spot that this is a high-risk situation. So caregivers who don't have well-treated mental health problems, or who are feeling stressed and burdened, care recipients who are combative, and gosh, you know, these are things that we usually can do something about. Love working with Alzheimer's associations for support groups. Sometimes people need one-on-one counseling. Is there something we can do to help them understand what's triggering their loved one with a dementing illness to behave in this sort of way so that we can calm it down? Sometimes we even need to use medications, but of course we try non-pharmacologic methods first. But there are things we can do, and doing all of these things might kind of lower the temperature so that you never get into a situation where abuse or neglect is happening. So what have I learned? That we have to set the stage and establish rapport with people, right? We have to really sit down for a moment with a caregiver and ask them how things are going. Allow a private conversation to happen with the person with dementia as well as with the caregiver in a safe environment. I ask these questions of everybody. Is anybody hurting you at home? Has anybody harmed you? Is anybody using your money without your permission? Ask those questions of people. Ask caregivers about how they're doing. Boy, I can see that it's been really hard for you working with your mom. She has some behaviors that are very upsetting. Have you ever gotten to a point where you're yelling at her or hitting her? And I can't tell you, I occasionally have had a caregiver say yes. But what I've had more often happen is a caregiver say, I haven't hit her, but doctor, I've come this close. And then they cry. And then we can say to them, I am so glad you told me that. It is never okay to hit your mother, and I'm going to help you so that that never happens. And here's what we're going to do. And they walk out with at least one behavior that they can do differently, and with referrals, one or two, that we're going to really help them get done so that it never happens. And this is a golden opportunity that all of us have to role model how to behave with somebody who has a dementing illness, to show a caregiver that we truly care, and then to help them so that something bad really never happens. And we all have that opportunity. So let me close with just a few final points. So for those who can't see the fine print, it says also the bridge is out ahead. And this is just a reminder for me that sometimes the most important thing during an encounter with a person who has dementia and their family is going to be the smallest, subtlest clue. And that might be the most important message that we're getting. So we have to be good observers and good listeners in order to pay attention and not miss those sorts of things. This is to remind me to remind me for myself and to tell you that the older we get, the more different we become. And that all people with Alzheimer's and other dementias are not the same. And all of their families are not the same. And even though any one of us might have, a certain degree of expertise in dementing illnesses, we have to really treat every person and every family as the individuals that they are if we really want to understand what's going on and be helpful to them. This was a sign, a photo I took in Australia, which I thought was lovely. And it's a reminder that we need to build communities that enhance and encourage older adults to come out and be with us and not be separated and feel like others, but really to be welcomed into our hearts and into our communities. We don't really always see ourselves as we really are. And we need to help each other do a better job every day. We need to help our patients and our family members and our caregivers do a better job every day. And this is tough stuff. And sometimes we have to bring up difficult topics and hold up a little bit more of an accurate mirror. And we have to do that for ourselves as well, in order to really do what I think our jobs is, or at least what my job is as a family physician and a geriatrician, which is to help my patients and their families be their best, no matter what their circumstance is. So we have to know that it exists, look for it, recognize when we see it, call it out, and really, I think all of us in this room are at an extraordinary time when we have an opportunity to prevent abuse and neglect outright, to catch it at an early stage and ameliorate it, and to really help people diminish the amount of abusive and neglectful actions that are happening in this world. And so I really thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about this difficult topic. I believe we have a few minutes for some questions now as well. Thank you. You're gonna kind of have to go for it because there's really bright lights up here and it's hard to see, but it looks like there's somebody back there.
Good morning. Here I am.
Hello, person.
Thank you for that. In your slide on setting the stage, one of the bullet points was normalize the questions. The language we use is really important. Could you give us some examples of how you normalize the questions? Thank you.
Yep. So I'm gonna, since this is a conference on dementing illnesses, I'm gonna speak directly about that. When I'm talking to somebody with dementia, I don't care how advanced they are, I have one-on-one time alone with them, always. And if, even if they're nonverbal, I'll ask them how things are going and see if they can give me with body language or some kind of nonverbal communication how they're doing. I'll even look for things like, does their body language change when a caregiver walks out of the room? I've seen some people who've been kind of hunkered down, and when a particular person leaves the room, they sit back up. Doesn't diagnose abuse, but it makes me ask some questions and look for bruises and wounds and other sorts of things, which I have found on occasion. I will always ask the person with dementia in a language that I believe they understand, not talking down to them, but at least, you know, if they're having word finding difficulty, comprehension difficulty, understanding that, and saying things like, is anybody hurting you? And I think one of the most important things for people who have dementing illnesses is just, it has to be a quiet, calm environment with a little bit of time for them to be able to answer so that we're not rushing people through that kind of conversation. When I'm talking to caregivers, I'll say things like, you know, I ask everybody about this because caregiving can be a really overwhelming task. And I'll start with the, how are you doing? Question, and then go in from there. And I really will be actually quite straightforward about saying, have you ever gotten to a point where, you know, are you at a point where you're yelling, hitting, whatever? Partly that'll depend on what interaction I'm observing in the office, how direct I can be. But one thing I think that I really know as a primary care physician is I have the opportunity and luxury and honor to develop relationships with my patients and families that I think allow us to get to a point where we can have these sorts of conversations too. And frankly, most people are relieved to talk about it. Does that answer you well enough? Okay. Hello, other person?
Oh, is it on? Can you hear me? I have been a little bewildered in several different circumstances over the years as an RCFE administrator where there has been identified clearly a situation that is abusive. And, you know, you get community care licensing involved, you report it to long-term care ombudsman, even law enforcement. And at the end of the day, the situation gets lost in bureaucracy. And I just wondered if you had any suggestion in those instances for somebody in the RCFE sector where we at some point have to take a step back, and you have law enforcement, you have everyone telling you, all in the protection of resident rights, so to speak. If you had any suggestion.
And suggestions for
just avenues. I mean, we have a situation going on right now where they're without question. It's a situation of physical abuse from an adult daughter. There was a restraining order in place. Mom, at the end of the day, this is still her daughter. Mom with dementia comes in and out of wanting to see her daughter, wanting to be with her. We're told you cannot, if mom wants to see her, we have to allow her to see her. So it's just, I guess. I don't know what I'm talking. I feel like at a certain point we become somewhat helpless in situations that seem allowed to continue to flourish in the absence of obvious abuse.
Yeah. You're right. And no, I don't have it. No, I'm just kidding. I can't. I'm gonna sort of. I can't. I don't think there's a specific question. I think you're sort of bringing up an issue here that I want to address, which is one of the issues that happens, especially in people with dementia, is, we're still adults with our rights and responsibilities, although they may be diminishing somewhat over time. And it may be in people with dementia that the only person they can still recognize is the person who's abusing them. And so under those circumstances, it's so frustrating to go, this is the daughter who's hitting her and we're going to let her in. Well, maybe that's the one person that older adult is still able to recognize, and that brings her some joy, and we can do it under supervision so that nothing harmful is happening, where we have wonderful people like you, and there's some fantastic RCFEs out there who really can help protect and supervise these sorts of things. When we get to a point where there's restraining orders, that's a rare event, and then that means something really bad has happened. And law enforcement, no offense to law enforcement, they don't know what to do in these things, because if you ask a law enforcement officer if they would rather go into a dark alley with somebody who has a gun or into a place where people have dementia, they'll take the dark alley. They really don't know how to interact and interview people who have dementing illnesses. And that's not a slam on law enforcement. They've got to know so many things about so many different issues that sometimes they sort of miss the boat and just go after sort of this legalistic option that might not be what's best for that person and for their family. So I think what I'm welcoming now is more interaction with folks like you, with the Ombudsman program, with Adult Protective Services. Orange County probably has one of the top adult protective services in the country, and I go around the country, and so I can tell you that with good confidence, of people who have got good common sense and want to help make this better. Ombudsman is up against a very difficult issue in that it's a mostly volunteer organization trying to look at all of these licensed facilities. And there's better and worse degrees of training and ombudsman programs all around the country as well. So I think that whenever we see a situation like this and we get frustrated, we have to resist the temptation to say, this is it, I'm done with it, and instead say, how do I make it better? And I'd love to talk with you later so that you and I can think about how we make this better. And I think my message is, don't give up. None of us can give up. We have to keep moving forward no matter how frustrated we are with the responses or lack thereof, and make things better, because you might be the most important person in that older adult's life, and you need to protect them as well.
So a question from the card. How many questions of the caregivers are needed to do an adequate screen?
2.6.
Next question.
I really think it depends on the circumstance. So remember that AIM model we talked about? It just sort of depends on the degree of complication in that situation. So for example, I was seeing a patient last week. We were newly diagnosing her with Alzheimer's disease. Her family was there. It took me, about 2 minutes of private conversation with the older adult and with the family to realize there is no problem. A total of 2 minutes. I talked with my patient separately. I said, how are things going at home? Are you afraid of anybody hurting you, anybody using your money? Nope, life is good. Went and talked to the family. Clearly good relationships, no problem, and I'm done with it. Whereas there are other circumstances where it takes a lot more detailed questioning. The other point I'll make is that I work in a team. I've got great social workers and psychologists and pharmacologists and occupational therapists and others working with me, so it doesn't all have to fall on me either. And sometimes they can do a better job, they have the better relationship with a family member and are in a better circumstance to be asking some of these questions too. So we also take that sort of a team approach. No other questions? Oh, there's another question.
Yeah, I apologize. I wasn't here for the beginning of your talk. How does someone appear before you?
I covered that in the beginning. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, I gotta have a little fun, okay? It's Friday. Give me a break. How does somebody appear before me? I mean, I'm a doctor, so they make an appointment, or do you mean related to elder abuse, or? Oh. Right. So I mean, as a family doctor geriatrician, there are some people who see me in my office, and so I have a regular old office practice related specifically though to abuse and neglect. I get consultations from law enforcement. I just testified in a trial recently in Victorville, and so I get called by law enforcement. I have decided that I don't want to make a living out of doing these sorts of things, and so when we do get paid for testifying in criminal trials, et cetera, the money goes to our program to help support the work that we're doing. And I rarely take a private case, but I do work in the criminal arena a bit around the country. Is that what you were asking? I don't think so, but he just nicely agreed. Thank you. A couple more, yes.
What do you recommend if you get from the caregiver that the patient or the person with dementia is becoming violent? It's not quite, but it's getting close, and of course the person's not going to do anything, but it's getting close. What happens when they cross that line and they became the abuser? Yeah,
and this is a really important point for a couple reasons. One, that really happens, and the other I find is that paid caregivers are often very hesitant to say that they're getting hit or bitten or pinched or whatever because they don't want to lose their job. And so I always talk to paid caregivers privately as well to find out if they are actually getting, I'll use the word abused, although I'm a little careful because I don't think people with dementia can mostly be held accountable for these sorts of things. So the first thing we always try to figure out is there an untreated medical problem going on that might be causing this behavior? Are they in pain? Is there something that's triggering this? Is it a mirror or something that gets them upset? So we're always looking for a non-medication kind of approach first, a behavioral approach. Is there something, I still will remember vividly when I was working here in Orange County, of a family who came to see me, and they said, Mom is like so aggressive and agitated, and she would sit in my office, and I know that people can behave very differently in the office than they do at home, but it just wasn't making sense. So I did a house call. They didn't tell me that they run a daycare program there, all right? I got terribly agitated when I walked in among all of those small children running around and screaming. And it honestly didn't occur to them because Mom had been in this situation, but now that she had dementia, it was very upsetting, and you could just see her mind going, and it was, right? So instead of, hey, they're coming in saying you got to medicate her, what we really needed to do was help educate and get her separated from that situation. So the first thing we do is figure out, is there a medical problem or some environmental trigger causing this behavior? And then sometimes we get to a point where, yes, they are having internal hallucinations, delusions related to their Lewy body dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever, and they actually will have a better quality of life if we treat them and bring down those psychotic symptoms and bring down some of those aggressive behaviors. I will often then also work with geropsychiatrists and neurologists to help figure out the best way forward on that, while we also work with the caregivers to help them understand non-pharmacologic approaches too.
I was just going to say, sometimes you have to educate your client. I had a young man whose mother was being financially abused in another state, and he was a professor. He had never heard of elder abuse. And so I had to explain in detail what this was and start giving him suggestions on what he could do, because I said, if you don't report this, I'll have to call the other state.
Yeah.
And he really stepped up. He learned so much. He's so bright. So he practically got a legal education dealing with this, got his made his mother safe because his brother was taking so much money away, she would have lost her housing. And his brother had no concern. I never met his brother, but
Yeah. Well,
but just to let you know, you have to kind of feel your way because they may not have any idea about what they're up against.
thank you for bringing this up. And one thing I routinely do now to encourage anybody is whenever we're making a new diagnosis or we're seeing somebody for the first time who has a dementing illness, to talk to them about financial abuse and protecting themselves. And so thank you for reminding me to, thank you for saying that and reminding me to talk about that as well.
I don't want to punish people for writing on cards, so I'm going to read these two cards. Can you speak to the correlation between financial abuse and physical abuse? And could you speak a little bit more about interventions for folks who find?
So financial and physical abuse, what we find is that oftentimes people who are suffering, this is called polyvictimization, are abused in one way or abused in multiple ways. The most common combination is emotional abuse and something else. But financial and physical absolutely go together. So that when you uncover something like financial abuse, you want to ask about other types of abuse as well, because it's very common for more than one kind of abuse to coexist in the same person and at the same time. When it comes to intervention, if the abuse is happening in the community, a non-licensed facility, we work with Adult Protective Services. If it's in a licensed facility, we work with the Ombudsman. You always have the option of calling law enforcement. But for me, the most important interventions are what we're doing in the office setting, which is understanding, helping, like not making it into a criminal matter, not calling anybody a bad guy, and just saying, I know you don't want this to be happening, and this has got to be really hard on you to even be in a position where you're yelling at your mom so much. We're going to help you. And this is when we call in our teams, and there's a lot of interventions we can do. And sometimes they need to be very intensive interventions. Like, this is not a support group intervention. I'm really going to insist at this point that you're getting some one-on-one counseling so that we can help you understand why you're reacting this way. Or even under one recent circumstance, this wife was really escalating to a point where she was already yelling at her husband and they were going to start getting physical. Things were beginning to happen, and we helped them have him move into a very nice RCFE close by. I just saw them on Wednesday. Everybody is happy. He is so much better. He has dementia with Lewy body. He is so much better living in this RCFE. He's in an environment that's designed for him. Nobody's yelling at him. And he just looked so much happier, and his wife looked happier too. So there's a whole variety of interventions we can do to help people.
One last question.
Make it really good and preferably easy.
Okay, I will. Have you found that pets are either a positive or negative in the abuse or neglect area?
Well, I think just in general, everybody should have a cat. Or a dog. I'm good with dogs too. So I don't know. I mean, there aren't any data on that. I believe, there certainly is information out there that pets can have a very soothing effect on people, and on people with dementia. One of the most emotional things I've ever seen, and this was a long time ago, I still remember it, was somebody who was in a nursing home with advanced dementia and was just so upset and tense, and somebody brought in a kitten and put it on her chest, and her whole body relaxed when that happened. And so I do believe that pets can have a very therapeutic effect, and not just on the person with dementia, but actually on the caregiver as well. So I think if you're in a circumstance where you really enjoy having an animal, and they are that sort of stress-relieving companionship, a whole variety of good things, that it helps the whole situation calm down, and that people can do much better.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.